Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our final Lunch and Learn session. Thank you, Emma, for coordinating them throughout the year. You've been awesome and fantastic, different variety of topics that we've discussed in this Lunch and Learn. I haven't managed to do all of them, but whenever I've joined, I've always been ever so grateful for the chance to be able to do that. Welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us. Our first speaker is going to be David. David is from Inenco. I think that's how you pronounce it, David.
Yes, that's right, yes.
And you're going to talk about heat decarbonisation plans, how they've evolved over the last 12, 18 months, and what some of the pros and cons and pitfalls are. Am I right in saying those things?
Yes, that's the right area. I mean,
yeah.
As much for interest, we were originally called it industrial energy costs, which is where INENCO was our telex number.
So without me yabbering on anymore, I'll let you get on. Please, if you want to ask any questions, either wait for end of the presentation or put them in the chat function. I will try and watch them because I'm a bit of a Wi-Fi issue at the moment as well. So David, my screen has gone blank. Is that you trying to share your screen?
I'm hoping people can see my screen that says NHS heat decarbonisation plans.
Nothing's coming up on mine. I don't know what anybody else is saying.
Have you got two-screen computer?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, we can see it.
We can see it.
Yeah, it could be a second screen. Sometimes it's on. Okay, I know we haven't got much time, so I'll just crack on. So I'm David Oliver. I'm from Inenco. So we're sort of energy brokers and third-party consultants. Now, you've no doubt seen the picture on the right-hand side here, which shows how the NHS needs to be have a carbon footprint of 0 by 20. By 2040, but also has to have a supply chain net zero carbon by 2045. Now, to be net zero carbon by 2040 requires a lot of improvements in things like anaesthetics and vehicles and NDIs and things like that, electricity. But we're talking today about heat decarbonisation plans, or HDPs, and these very much focus on heat. And where does heat come? It comes from fossil fuels. And for the majority of NHS sites, the fossil fuel in question is natural gas. So the big question from an HDP is, how can we wean that site off natural gas by 2040? So I'm just going to quickly give an overview of that. Now, what I should say from the start is HDPs are a relatively new thing, and where they've really started was from Salix. So Salix had something called the Low Carbon Skills Fund, or LCSF, which paid for heat decarbonisation plans, but they also required heat decarbonisation plans to be completed for public sector decarbonisation schemes, also known as PSDS. And because they want to make sure people are doing the same sort of things, they publish some guidelines for what they believe is sensible for an HDP. And, you know, whenever we do HDPs, we in Inenco, we always look at that guidance to make sure we cover all the bases. But we also look at other things like building fabric models, and, you know, we also look at what I would call as TCFD issues, which is the site climate ready? First step for any site is always energy efficiency. There's no point putting in a replacement heating system or green heating if you haven't first of all reduced your demand, and you reduce demand by energy efficiency. Now, one good thing is that public demand for electricity is currently about 10% down because of the energy crisis, and that means domestically, we're a lot more aware of energy. So now's a great time to implement energy awareness at work because people are energy aware. So if you had that recommendation that you should do better energy awareness, please go ahead and do that because it has very quick returns on savings. And this reduction in demand not only saves you money, potentially it frees up capacity on electricity if that's required. Now, we're aware that a lot of people think that the eventual solution will be hydrogen. And some people are sort of sitting back and thinking, oh, that's right, by 2040, I'll just change my gas boilers to hydrogen boilers and use the existing system. But it's not that simple. The picture on the right shows where the government has selected what they call hydrogen clusters. And that's by, you know, for work that goes up to about 2030. And you'll see they're mainly ports where there's industrial sites. There's also the ability to take the carbon dioxide and to pipe it out into the sea and put it under water, you know, into old gas fields. So that's why you find that, for example, you know, a place like Humberside Teesside may be suitable for hydrogen, but somewhere like Bradford, for example, might not be. But you see, what will happen is the early sort of hydrogen production tends to be made from natural gas. So they take methane, strip out the carbon to produce hydrogen. So if that carbon is then sequestered underwater, that does make it zero carbon, but it's still got finite resource. It's still using natural gas, which is not sustainable. So the only way to make it sustainably is actually by electrolysis. Now you need about 1.25 kilowatt hours of electricity to produce 1 kilowatt hour of hydrogen, and yet that 1.25 kilowatt hours of electricity could produce about 4 kilowatts hours of heating if you put it through a heat pump. So hydrogen may not be the best thing. You know, we think that the early uses for hydrogen would be mainly transportation, long-range transportation. In fact, there's a hydrogen train being tested, but we think it'll also be used in processes. So, for example, in Merseyside, I think St Helens Glass are looking at a scheme, and sites which can use things like heat pumps or other forms of heating may have to look at other cheaper alternatives. So that's just showing that's the high net potential network that's going to happen in the Liverpool area, the Wirral area. People also talk about biofuels. So, you know, biomass boilers use wood chip, but of course there's only so much wood chip that's available. It depends whether you have wood chip in your area, but also wood chip takes up space. You could have storage issues on your site. You could have deliveries of wood chip, and it also creates air quality issues, and that may conflict with natural biomass strategies. And the other thing to remember, of course, is that you have much more heating demand in the winter than you do in the summer. So things like anaerobic digestion, which is shown in the picture on the right-hand side, is not really suitable because that produces a fairly steady amount of gas throughout the year. Whilst in fact you may want 2 or 3 times more gas in the winter than you do in the summer. So these are the things to think about. The other thing Salix say is you should talk to the local council about heat networks. Now, unfortunately, many of the councils developed heat networks using CHPs or waste to energy, and those are not zero carbon. And in our experience, very few councils currently have a strategy that relies on net zero carbon heating, but that may change. That's the current position. It may not be the case in the future. Something else we look at is heat pumps. That's just a diagram. What I'll do is I'll send copies of these slides to you at some point, so you don't need to take too many notes. But the big issue with heat pumps is that air source heat pumps are less efficient and have less capacity when it's cold. And also they're required going through what they call a defrost cycle, which may mean they need to have thermal buffers. It's much better to have ground source heat pumps, but unfortunately the ground source heat pumps rely on the underground geology being suitable. You need to have either flowing water or other permeability issues, and unfortunately we think that very few sites have that. And the thing to notice also is the heat pumps tend to produce water at about 45-50 Celsius, which means you need new radiators and pipes and so on. And these are pretty expensive options. So you look at the various options, then you have to start thinking about plans. You have to start thinking about roadmaps. Now, the first roadmap, if you like, is 0 to 3 years. And guess what? That's what the Green Plan is, or part of the Green Plan. It's what's happening in the immediate future. And that may include applying for public sector decarbonisation projects, maybe as part of this pilot scheme. It also looks at estate strategies. It looks at what the energy markets are doing, and it looks at improved monitoring of particularly heat use on site. Then in the medium term, you look at energy infrastructure, you look at replacement of equipment such as chillers, because you may not realise this, but chillers, of course, are also heat producers. And hospitals, or acute hospitals, are one of the few places where you may have cooling and heating required at the same time. The other thing you do is you want to talk to your local council, keep in line with them on their decarbonisation plans for the region. And then you have to start thinking about planning, and you have to understand what the energy markets are doing and when the right time might be to switch from gas to electricity. And then the long-term actions are more like 10 to 15 years, which takes you out close to the 2040s. So you need to be looking to be decarbonised probably by about 2038, just to give yourself some flexibility, some extra time. And you have to look at, do you have the right plans? Do you have a CHP on the site? That may not be applicable, but if you do, you'll probably have to decommission it. You probably need extra electrical capacity from the DNO. And, you know, as I say, you'll have to have detailed designs and also ideas of where the money comes from, because I'm not going to tell you this is cheap, because it's not cheap, it's very expensive. And then after that, we start plotting a route to net zero carbon for heating. And that program depends on many things. It depends on regional factors, national incentives, you know, the cost of electricity and gas, state strategies, all sorts of things. But typically there'll be an element of energy efficiency. There'll be some big changes, for example, due to decommissioning of CHP. There may be some changes due to blending of hydrogen into the grid gas, but that will only be 25% maximum. And eventually there'll have to be a decision to make big steps. So if you look at the end, you can see it goes down to zero. And that's actually, in this particular case, it's, you know, it's typically showing the installation of heat pumps, but it may be some other technology. But you have to think about what the roadmap looks like and how you will achieve it before 2040. And unfortunately, it's not easy. So, sorry, this is a little bit of a plug for an ENCO, but just to say that we've already done quite a few heat decarbonisation plans for both acute hospitals and also clinics, you know, as part of either, you know, as well as Salix applications. We already do lots and lots of energy audits each year for both public sector, but also for industrial customers. We do building fabric assessments, including thermal cameras and modelling. We look at renewables, solar PV. I should say, by the way, that solar PV will not be a low carbon technology, because by 2035, the grid is expected to be zero carbon. And in any case, the NHS buys green electricity. We also look at CHPs, but that's often to find out when they should be retired. And we look at things like heat pumps and as well as other biomass systems. The other thing we do is we're brokers. We buy electricity and gas for our customers. And what we know is that there has to be the right time to switch from gas to electricity. And that's likely to be because electricity starts to become decoupled from gas. So at the moment, the marginal cost of generation is combined cycle power stations, which run on gas. In the future, it's more likely to run on things like subsidies and it's contracts for difference for offshore wind farms and nuclear power stations. And also gas may well start to have more and more non-commodity costs incurred. So we think there needs to be a swing in the value or the cost of gas compared to the cost of electricity to force people into the route of alternative heating systems. And, you know, finally, we help a lot of our customers to look at lower carbon, but also we don't forget about the changes of due to climate change. So before we recommend that you spend 20, 30, 40 million pounds on a hospital, we always check whether it's in a flood zone. We also say, you know, do we think that the building fabric will need to be increased, you know, to get better disposal of rainwater, for example? And, you know, we do know that even if we're zero carbon by 2040, that will not stop sea levels rising. It will not stop CO2 levels rising in the world as a whole, because the UK is only a small drop in the ocean. So we need to be climate ready. And I whistled through that fairly quickly, but I will stop now and just say, are there any questions? Hopefully you heard that.
Thanks, David. That was fabulous. I didn't note any questions on the chat function. So are people happy to stick their hand up and ask any questions? Have you got something burning in your...
I mean, alternatively, there are other speakers and we'll probably have a bit of a panel at the end, I would have thought. Yeah.
Yeah. So I can't see any hands
there
going
is
up.
A question.
Sorry, Emma, I can't.
Sorry, there is a question from Luke in the chat, David. It was familiar on in your presentations and
well, that's COP improved. Yeah, so COP
improved,
sets a coefficient of performance. And what it means is that's the relationship between the electricity you put into a heat pump and the heat you get out. Now, in the next 10 years, we would expect heat pumps to get cheaper and also to get more efficient. So we would expect the COP to improve. But a lot of the costs associated with heat pumps are to do with things like bigger radiators and pipe.
In Australia, obviously, like, you know.
Sorry, we've got somebody with not muting. Okay, thanks.
Sorry, David, it's Luke. It was more around hydrogen with the one unit of 1.25 units of electricity for one of hydrogen. Is there any technology on the horizon to improve that transfer?
No, I think to actually get more energy out than you put energy in would be a perpetual motion machine.
Yeah. Okay.
So I don't think it exists. I mean, I know there are things like desalination, which have things like 1 ton of steam gives you 8 tons of water and so on. But you know, we think that electrolysis is likely to be the renewable future for hydrogen. But equally, we think that the first hydrogen will get used for other things. And then the UK government target is for 42 terawatt hours of hydrogen by 2030. And that's only 5% of our total demand.
So the hope is, I guess, at some point in the future, we're generating so much electricity that it doesn't matter that we're running a load of hydrogen plants.
Well, the problem with hydrogen is how you get it to your hospitals, because at the moment, the grid can take a maximum of 25% in places, and they're doing tests on that. But they think that if you go to 100% hydrogen, first of all, your grids will leak too much, and secondly, you'll have domestic customers with explosions happening because they haven't done the right handover. So there is a feeling that hydrogen will never be the total solution. It'll be part of the solution, as so many of these things are. But I think if you rely on hydrogen for your future, you may be kidding yourself.
Thank you.
Sorry, Tony has a question.
Thanks, David. I'm from an NHS trust that covers parts of South and West Yorkshire. You mentioned that in regard to heat pumps, they work better if there's an on-site source. We're pretty sure that under some of our sites there are old mine workings, and we're just thinking about what we need to do to look into that at the moment. What I wanted to ask you was, are you aware of any existing work in that area, or has your company been involved in anything like that? Thanks.
Right, so at ENCO don't get involved in things like geology or anything like that. That's not our specialist subject. But what's very interesting with like underground heat pumps, and it's similar to the mines heat pumps, is that in London there are 2 projects where they actually have air source heat pumps, but they're actually located in old abandoned tube stations. And what's happened there is that the tube stations typically are about 20 Celsius, summer and winter. So therefore they pick up energy from the tube stations, which would otherwise be expelled to atmosphere, and they operate at higher temperatures, and therefore they're more efficient. But they're actually, funny enough, they are actually air source heat pumps, but they operate as if they were ground source heat pumps underground. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks. Right, Hawaran, you've got your mute. Thanks.
One day. Thank you, David. That was fabulous. I can't see any more hands up, and I haven't seen any more questions pop up on the chat function either. Craig, are you ready to go? And do you have slides that you can share? And if there are any, if people do think of any questions, please save them till the end. But we're just, yeah, is that Craig's screen? My laptop's ever so slow, so it's I'm hoping that you can all hear me as I'm speaking and not having a 30-second delay in it all. That's fabulous, thank you. So that's great. I can see Craig's screen now. So Craig, go for it.
Thanks, Warren. So in terms of if people don't know the history of this session, it was planned to be done in September when I worked at Bradford Teaching Hospitals. I've now moved, so I'm now the group head of sustainability at Northern Care Alliance. So what I've done is I've tried to take into account what we did over the last few years at Bradford, and then added a couple of other things nearer the end in terms of what we're currently now looking at as part of the Northern Care Alliance. So as I say, I'm Craig Wilson. I'm now the group head of sustainability at Northern Care Alliance, and hopefully, as I say, I've tried to put a set together that gives you an idea of what we did at Bradford, but then also sort of asks other questions of sort of decarbonisation strategies. So in terms of a bit of background for people that don't know, so there's several different documents now out supporting this agenda. So the net zero carbon emissions for scope 1 and 2 by 2038 for the West Yorkshire area. Again, that's different throughout the NHS, but as I say, the overall action one for the NHS is scope 1 and 2 net zero by 2040. But I think the other thing to consider, and something that we looked at, was the 2032. So by 2032, trusts need to have an interim target of carbon footprints by an 80% reduction from a 1990 reference year. So what we did at Bradford was we put a heat decarbonisation in place using the SALEX guidance that you can see there on the left. So we know that then if we wanted to go for any sort of public sector decarbonisation money in the future, we were able to submit that heat decarb plan knowing full well that it complied with their guidance document. The document itself appraised all heat sources as well as reviewing all of our sources of heat currently on the two hospital estates that we surveyed, and identified electricity as the future heating source and hot water provision to align to the targets that we set out in the scoping document. So as you can see there, that's sort of the on the right hand side of the table is sort of showing the direction of travel to get to that 80% 2032 target, with obviously then the residual really then is the difficult things to try and tackle with the remaining 20% to 2038 for us in West Yorkshire, as it was for myself. So then what the next stage that we then conducted was we started then looking, because we were aware that going forward it would be very electricity centric. We then started looking at a piece of work to understand both in terms of capacity, loading, and also what was the future look like on our estate in terms of the net zero appraisal. So that looked at the whole piece in terms of everything that we did in terms of emitting carbon dioxide. So as you can see there, future of diesel generators came into question in terms of when we looked at a net zero appraisal, generation of power on our own site, and what was the total capacity. So what I would say is we looked at the total capacity, which is different to the actual feasibility. So we looked at the total figure for the whole site, and eliminated any areas where it wasn't feasible due to shading, etc., for solar panels, but then left it at that. So some of the sites probably would never have solar panels on, but to allow you to then do the maximum loading calculations, you need to know and understand what the total maximum amount of solar panels and other forms of renewable generation was on site. We then factored in ventilation. So using the new HTM guidance, we then re-evaluated all of our wards and departments and to future-proof them in terms of the HTM. Therefore, again, coming up with an additional load that was required to change for ventilation. And then looking at EV charging requirements and then also batteries. So on our sites, looking at things and innovation and ways of using power and becoming things like energy islands. So working with National Grid when there was difficulties in the outside network, how we could become and support our local community through our decarbonisation plan, which I'll come on to in a minute. In terms of then the electrical loading and capacity study itself, we actually reviewed every single panel in the trust. So the two main sites, we reviewed every single panel to understand how much loading was on every board and whether any boards were able to be expanded. So what the cabling infrastructure was to that, which then was obviously then allows us to then work on that localized heat boosting from things like air source, ground source heat pumps. So we're now in a position, or Bradford is now in a position to understand exactly where there is hotspots, where there is enough capacity, and then also looking at the HV ring main. So understanding what the HV capacity is as it is, and then building into that all of the calculations that we put in terms of the net zero appraisal. We could then put a total figure on what our site would, or both of our sites would need in the future. I've also then put in terms of, we evaluated in terms of flood risk and resilience of the substations off the network in terms of from the DNO and our own on-site substations, because obviously going down a very electric centric future for those two buildings, we need to ensure that the right sort of contingency measures are in place, even though, as I say, we'd have either batteries or diesel generation from civil contingencies. We need to ensure that our major investment was secure in terms of future electricity use. So what I've done now is I've split out in terms of the next phase for when I was at Bradford, but also some of the discussions that have now taken place now I've joined Northern Care. So for us, in terms of phasing, we would then start looking at the outer infrastructure, so the HV, and upgrading all the substations and generation facilities around the substations on sites. So that would be sort of phase one. We then started looking at, right, okay, so as we start this a phased approach, how do we do it? Which one comes first? Which part of the building comes first? And then that would align in terms of the pound sign to, is there available funding to allow you to do that phasing? So for example, if it was going to take us 8 years to deliver a full decarbonisation strategy for one of the sites, potentially PSDS funding would be available for certain aspects in terms of depending on the criteria that were set from SAILEX. And then looking at the technologies, so obviously the different types of ways of providing heating and hot water to certain aspects of buildings. It could be more efficient to put point of use in for certain areas, or, as I say, depending on where it is on the site. Grid electricity availability now and in the future. So again, that good communication line with the DNO to understand what is the current availability in the network, what are the future plans to strengthen the network around the hospital sites for now and in the future. Because again, if you're going through a phased approach, you might not be able to in the first year take as much as you need from the network. So again, putting that future plan in place, because DNOs work in 5-year cycles. So that real good communication line into that, sort of your local DNOs, is another one to sort of lessons learned. As David sort of touched on, the radiator at the bottom, that's another one in terms of moving from a lot of our sites with steam. So moving from steam down into a much lower temperature. Is there enough room in the areas to allow you to put bigger radiators in and accept lower temperature heat? And then innovation. So there must be innovation in this sector. Heat recovery, for example, off air handling units. How can we take that heat better rather than it going back into the atmosphere? Electric charging points, again, in terms of the phasing strategy. Providing, at Bradford, we were looking at prioritising for our fleet. So looking at where the fleet could be stored, parked, and then applying that back to where there's available capacity. HVAC systems, UPS, IPS, we were looking at potential working with suppliers in terms of how could we, with battery technology, utilise that instead of UPS, so that that was quite an interesting discussion. So again, some sort of things to think about going forward. The next one, oops, for some reason it stalled. There you go. So the other thing is sort of the hidden costs and costs around the edge of your projects. So one at Bradford for sure is asbestos. A lot of our ductwork was absolutely covered in asbestos in terms of the pipework for heating supplies. So again, when you're looking at putting phasing strategies together and putting your heat decarbonisation, understanding those opportunities, but also potentially hidden costs. And like I put there, hidden costs can be both positive and negative. So for example, a piece of like an air source heat pump now, potentially in another 5 years will be more efficient and cheaper to buy. So again, utilising that as you start using, I've put that timeline there in terms of that phasing strategy, taking all those different elements and factors and trying to build it into a phasing strategy so that you can optimize and create opportunities, as well as ensure that certain aspects of the hospital are operational at all times. So for example, decarbonising places like A&E, and ICU. It's going to be very difficult, and also communicating with infection control teams and clinical teams in terms of areas of the hospital will in the future need to be closed for certain lengths of time if you were to change the infrastructure. Things like fabric of the building, potentially air tightness and things like that may need to be improved. And then in terms of submetering, so again, at Northern Carolines, we're looking at submetering now to allow us in the future to specify the right size and sizing of air source heat pumps, which is absolutely crucial. So again, if you're not looking at submetering at the moment, that will definitely help in the future in terms of allowing you to size the correct sized air source heat pump for that ward and department going forward, because oversizing again is an inefficiency. So at the moment, most people look at submetering as a way of gauging consumption to an area, but this is actually quite a proactive approach to heat decarbonisation plans. We actually now need to have that data to allow us to size the equipment going in the future better, because at the moment you will be using modelling, whereas if you actually had that data, you'd then be able to say, right, okay, we need to improve the fabric as well as put this size air source heat pump in. Obviously, Salex, one of the major contributors in terms of financing the NHS's decarbonisation strategies. Again, keeping afloat of their criterias and their opportunities in terms of finance. I've put corporate social responsibility. Again, that's as an anchor organisation, we have to make sure that we are sort of follow our CSR requirements. But fundamentally, you've got that approach in terms of we can't just take all the power off the grid, because fundamentally we're taking that off the communities that we're serving. So again, causing them to have brownouts and blackouts, which again, from a health perspective and a population health perspective, will have a detrimental impact. So we have to take that approach, and as I say, that really proactive discussions with the distribution network operators will help that in terms of that future plans, their 5-yearly plans, and then trying to look at what will the building estate look like in 50 years, 100 years time. And it's really looking at the fabric, because, as I say, most of the equipment that's inside the building will have a lifespan of a lot shorter than that. So it's that whole life approach, which then sort of leads you to the final question that I've put is the trust decarbonisation strategy or plan, is it the actual new estate strategy? So this is a concept that we're currently looking at the Northern Carolines in terms of, actually, when we start looking at a refurb of a ward, the first thing that we need to do is it ready for net zero? Is it net zero ready? Rather than sort of just looking at, right, okay, we need to upgrade the oxygen supply to that area. We need to look at sort of the fixtures and fittings of that area. Actually, let's start by saying, right, how does it fit with our decarbonisation strategy? So going forward, is it actually the new estate strategy, looking at tackling backlog maintenance as well as tackling the backlog maintenance? We're creating a net zero fabric and a net zero estate. Future capital investment programs, again, how does that impact on net zero? Because fundamentally, if we build a building now and within the next 20 years we then have to put huge retrofit back onto it, we've not future-proofed that building to a net zero world, which again, under the Climate Change Act of 2008, you have to be net zero by 2050 by law. So although we've got ambitions of getting there earlier, we still have to get there. So that every sort of capital investment program going forward needs to have that right at the very front, which I think if we had that as part of a decarbonisation strategy instead of an estate strategy, that could potentially be an interesting concept going forward. Obviously, that would also then include estates master planning of your estate and future, looking at how the hub and spoke model could work, and looking at sustainable care models in ways where your sites become specialist hub sites, but then the spoke sites take that pressure off, and allow you to create that sustainable care models, and then looking at estate rationalisation and Lord Carter metrics. So really looking at that, all the estate's functionalities, 6 facet surveys, all of that, actually look at it through a decarbonisation lens. So yeah, I thought I'd finish on sort of something that we're starting to think of at the Northern Care Alliance, and how actually we could transform our estates going forward, and start right now by actually implementing it as the new estate strategy concept. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Craig. As ever, millions of questions coming to a head, but of course I don't want to even start on that. I know where you are. So I think, are there any questions? So lots of positive comments on the chat function, but do we have any questions? Do we have any questions in the chat? Oh, you've stood.
I have
You've
a
stood
question.
Go for
Sorry.
it. I can't see your hand up, and I can't see who it is.
I'm sorry, my name's Mary.
Mhm.
I've got a question. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Go for it.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks, Craig, for that. That was very useful. My name's Mary. I'm the Net Zero Technical Lead at NHS England, and one of what we've been doing is getting trusts to position themselves to have heat decarbonisation plans, and clearly the work that you've done, Craig, is a lot of the what we're advocating across the trust. I just wondered if you can share with the room in terms of some of the costs that was involved in developing this, i.e. from the initial stages and some of the detailed feasibilities that you've started to do, and how did you kind of get that through your trust capital planning processes or your heads of estates to fund some of this work? I think would be quite useful insight.
Yeah, so in terms of if you split it into two, we had the overarching heat decarb plan, which again we funded internally. We did apply for the low carbon skills fund for that, but we're unsuccessful. So again, we applied for that, and then the other one in terms of the capital, we looked at that in two sort of distinct ways. In terms of the HTM electrical, and ensuring that we had significant and suitable supplies both now and for the future, and from a heat decarbonisation perspective, we put it in, so we were managed to get that funded again internally, on the basis that we were able to then provide our AE with assurance from an electrical perspective that we were running our estate well within its capacity and loading. And then in terms of that future proofing, and then the innovative piece in terms of looking at the concepts regarding how do we get the whole estate to a net zero position. But again, that again was internally funded, but came on the back of, as I say, a request both from the AE and from myself in terms of how can we collaborate and put this whole piece together and get it signed off. But as I say, they are sometimes really expensive, in terms of the expense. But again, as I say, the low carbon skills fund. The other thing that we did approach in West Yorkshire was the energy hubs, which I know they're BEIS funded.
That's right.
So potentially they're a good option as well to approach in terms of getting funding for.
Fantastic. That was useful. Thank you, Craig. Great work.
Is David still around? And do we have any more questions? While people are thinking, hi, thanks, David. While people are thinking of any questions, we did have a third presentation, a Luke champion, and he couldn't make it. But then, of course, he sent us a video clip, which Emma has, and Emma's hotspotting, so she's not able to play it, as we can't even see her, let alone a video clip. So the promise is that Emma will send the video clip. We'll do some work on it to make it sort of compact enough to be sent via email, and then Emma will send a hyperlink as well as the 2 sets of slides. Am I right, Craig and David, in terms of sharing your slides?
Yes. Yeah.
So we'll send that out, and it won't be today because Emma's still hotspotting, so she's not going to do anything today. Well, she'll do lots of work, just in a roundabout way. So any other questions? I'm quite interested to find out if other people are having problems. What are the issues that people are facing in their own trust? And it would be quite good to understand.
Sorry, Helen had a question for Craig, which said, was he able to identify tackling backlog?
Mm-hmm.
Don't know whether you're still there, Craig. You go off my screen.
He has gone from my screen.
Oh, there he is.
You
He's back
are.
now.
Sorry. So in terms of it tackling backlog, that is something in terms of going forward with the phasing that we were looking at. So in terms of that phasing approach, we were looking at evaluating the backlog, and then as you start building up the backlog program, sort of a re-roof. So as you're re-roofing, also then add all the additional sort of insulations and U values. So how do we make that building more airtight on top of the backlog in terms of the re-roof or the current problems that are occurring in terms of single glazing or leaky windows, etc.
Any other thoughts? That's good, fabulous. Emma's commented on the fact that she's struggling to get anything on, and it will be available. I don't have any more. I can't see any more questions. I'm not very good at this.
It's just interesting. I noticed, by the way, that there was a question from the Ambulance Trust from Alexis. And so on.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth noting that the NHS is moving gradually towards electric ambulances. They're going to be manufactured at Dagenham and the Ford plants, and I think at the moment they've got about 105 kilowatt hour batteries, and they're talking about having 125 kilowatts chargers, so fast chargers, and that is obviously a challenge for all trusts really that might have acute services that they may need to have charging available for ambulances in the future. Now that will initially be more city-wise, but we may start to see it more and more rural. John's sort of talking something and he's counting on his fingers, but
yeah,
he's muted.
I was thinking the same.
I'm trying to raise my hand up now.
Mary, you've got your hand up. John, do you want to come in? I'm sorry, just see if John's unmuted. John, are you able to unmute and come on? Because you seem to be saying something. Right, he's gone. Okay, Mary, you can come in. I can't see him.
Sorry, I didn't know my camera was off. Can you see me now?
Yes,
great.
We can see you.
Perfect. So, thanks. My other questions for you, David. You mentioned in your slide about renewables not being part of the what you would consider as a transition towards that low carbon heat, and I just wondered if you could explain that in a bit more detail.
Sorry, what I mean is electrical renewables, so things like solar PV or wind turbines, because the NHS currently buys green electricity. So therefore, your electricity import is zero carbon. Now, generate your own electricity. It does have additionality. It does have good PR, but it doesn't actually improve your carbon footprint. So that's something to be aware of. But it does provide a long-term hedge for energy prices. So I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I'm just saying it doesn't help the carbon argument. And what we also know from the government is that they say by 2035, electricity grid will be net zero carbon anyway. So even if you buy off none market, if you buy locational, it'd still be zero carbon. Yeah,
no, absolutely. I think I wanted to kind of understand your point so I could make the difference, because with the rigor electricity, and if it's slightly different in terms of, because that still has a carbon content to it, and so we don't necessarily count that as net zero. But I agree, where we do buy or have our own renewable electricity, then that's where the questions of additionality comes in. I think one of the things that we advocate is the resilience that PVs bring as well, in terms of your own self-supply as well. But in terms of the quantum of delivering the supply, I agree, it's a fraction of the overall scenario. But in terms of energy resilience and self-supply and energy security, it is part of the narrative as well. So thanks for clarifying that. I just thought I'll just layer in it.
Thanks. I noticed Pete Waddington had a question also relating to an ENCO.
Yeah.
I don't have the exact
Pete,
numbers with me. I don't do our SECA reports, but I know that during the pandemic, ENCO did a carbon offset for its home workers based on estimated carbon footprints for the home workers who were obviously there because of the pandemic. So that may be the reason why they've got the increased carbon footprint. Obviously, our transport footprint was very low in 21 and 22. Sorry, 20 and 21.
Okay, thanks. Just Alexis, you've got your hand up first, and Pete, you've got a question on the chat and you've got your hand up. So shall I let Alexis go first, and then you can ask 2 questions, Pete? Go on, Alexis.
Hi there. So I'm sorry I missed the beginning of the presentations, but with ICASP, which is a regional catchment management, ran a conference a couple of weeks ago looking at the ground source heat pump aspects and the potential for, and I know Mary chucked a link in the chat, for looking at coal mines and the potential within the region to look at ground source heat pumps being a greater potential. What do you think of that? I mean, David and Craig, retrospectively, would you have looked into something like that? Because as a perpetual heat source, it's got real potential, and as you're saying, unfortunately within Yorkshire we're not going to have that underground potential, as in underground train service, but is there a potential like that around the whole of the country you've seen?
It does depend on the geology. I mean, you know, if you look at mines, for example, if the mines are flooded with stagnant water, then if you start extracting energy from there, the water will eventually get colder and freeze. So that's no good. It has to be flowing water. It has to be there has to be a certain amount of energy available at all times. So there has to be underground rivers, and you know, and if you look at the water that comes through boreholes, for example, and drop it by a few degrees, that's not enough. It's only that's tens of kilowatts. So you are looking at quite substantial amounts of underground moving water, or porosity, should we say, or permeability of the rocks. And as you say, Yorkshire may not be the best place for all that. It's probably more likely to be in the south of England, but the problem is it's quite hard to do. There's 2 types of ground source heat pump. There's the type where they bury pipes just a few, maybe a metre or 2 below the ground level, and there's the type where they drill big boreholes. And unfortunately, both those require both space, and they're also very expensive. So it's a big option to start looking at ground source heat pumps. I mean, it has operational advantages, but it still produces water at fairly low temperatures. And I think Craig touched on the fact that it may be 45-50 degrees water, so it needs new radiators, and the new radiators and pipes are more expensive than the heat pumps. But the other thing is, he talked about infection control, Craig did, and for water storage for hand washing and so on, it needs to be above 60 degrees of storage, so it does require boosting for Legionella control. Pete's got his hand up, I think. Thanks.
Yeah. Craig, did you want to respond to Alexis? I know Alexis asked both, or are you okay with that, Alexis?
We
Right,
did look
okay.
at it at Bradford. We did look at look at borehole and underground. So when ENCO did our heat decarb plan, we did pass on the information that we had in terms of geology below, but again the geology wasn't suitable, and the water availability was in terms of availability wasn't sufficient enough throughout the year. There wasn't a sustainable amount of groundwater underneath, and then there was other areas in terms of we were just unfortunate in terms of the geology directly below our site. So yeah, unfortunately it was not a runner.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks, David. Pete, you have a question on chat as well, and you've got your hand up.
I think that's been answered. It was a bit of a reflection. I'm going to try and turn this into a question. So I'm just mindful of what was said, David, around the like renewable energy, and then I think it was Mary's sort of counter question, and what I'm wondering is there a guiding document that really hands this on a plate to people to think of some principles to consider and to ponder upon? Because what I'm sensing in this topic is it's like everything, unfortunately, it gets really, really complicated quite quickly. There's some brilliant expertise out there that have already got the answers in their head. We're just not very good at sort of articulating that and helping people navigate, and we end up sort of bombarded them with complexity in documents. I think I'm just wondering whether there's something that just helps put some principles down about this topic, really. So, you know, like you said, the renewable energy is a good example. If people went after that now and started creating solar farms and wind farms, which we know people are doing, kind of the counter to that is, like you're saying, that actually the grid would do that anyway, and you know, that's done it on a macro scale. But then the flip side of that is it might give you some, you know, mitigation in you know, if things fail. So I'm just wondering whether there's any principles that we can help people guide towards to help them think how to develop their approach, really, and more importantly, get the right innovation into the areas that are needed.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the wider picture, I mean, I know there will be a new energy bill next year from the government, and that will talk about things like nuclear and also renewables and so on. Also, Craig mentioned about DNOs becoming more innovative and flexible. And that's part of, they have a 5-year process called RIO, and they start RIO 2 in April of next year. And that means that they potentially start looking to people to export power or to be more flexible and to use, you know, flatter demand profiles and things like that. So we will see those sort of things. I mean, from the NHS point of view, there was supposed to be a zero carbon building programme in place, and that sort of seems to have stagnated, and government promises to build new hospitals perhaps are not as clear as they used to be. But you know, one thing we see quite a lot of, we see someone who's built something in the last year, and we say, well, if you'd asked us a year ago, we wouldn't have built it like that. You know, if you want to build, and Craig mentioned this, you know, with the state strategy, that if you build a new A&E, for example, we'll build it with underfloor heating. You can still run it on gas boilers today, but it's heat pump ready. And, you know, I think actually the preparation for the future is the key thing at the moment. And, you know, when you look at new equipment, for example, if you put a chiller in, why not put a chiller in with heat recovery? Because you could use the heat recovery as underfloor heating.
I think what you're describing there is what I'm kind of looking for. It's the principles that I think would help people. Like you said, and I saw it in your presentation, Craig, and I've put in the chat the event that I'm organising in January next year. But I want to make sure that we uncover the innovation in the right areas, because a lot of this does exist. It's a case of just finding it and looking at the right, you know, networks. But if we can just kind of create some prompt questions. I mean, I've started creating checklists, and as sad as that sounds, I think they're quite important just for people just to kind of work through and get the thinking. So I think I'm looking for a checklist of or principles or something that just guides the guides a few of us, really. And the other thing that I'm really interested in, and I'll throw this in the mix really quickly and then I'll stop, but I'm keen on helping the supply chain decarbonise, because when we know that 70% of the NHS's footprint comes from scope 3 in its supply chain, we've got to be having the same conversation with our suppliers. So that's the event that I'm doing next year. It's as equally about the supply chain as it is the NHS. But thank you for your time. I don't need an answer now, but I'd love to see a checklist.
I can probably answer that, actually, which is something called PPN 0621. Which is public procurement, public procurement notification 0621, which is originally a government department thing, but it's going to be introduced by the NHS from next year, initially for £5 million projects, right. But from the year after it'll be from zero projects. And that'll start to get suppliers to start thinking about their carbon footprint.
It does, but what it doesn't do, and this is what I'm keen to do, is it's all right baseline and getting your numbers, but what you do about it is the tricky part, and knowing how to decarbonise. Yeah. You know, and that's why I asked that question about how have an ENCO done 4 times the carbon footprint. I suspect there'll be, like you say, some offsetting in there. But as I say, I won't take up too much more time. I'll put my email in the chat as well, and you know, connect with us because it's a really good topic. This.
Yeah, but from 2030, that'll be part of the procurement process, the PPN 0621 by the NHS. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. No, thank you. That's really good. But there is a comment with a question mark from David North. And whilst you two are looking at that, Mary, I wonder if this is something what Pete was just saying now about having some, you know, questions, some metrics. Is that something that you and your team can help with? Because I can quite easily set up an MS Teams meeting to start having
Sorry,
those
I
discussions
didn't
with
catch your
Pete, with Craig.
Sorry, I didn't catch your questions, but I think you said something about metrics, but I didn't catch the beginning of it. Sorry.
Yeah, well, just what Pete was saying. He was asking a question about having something, some principles, some guiding principles that, you know, going forward.
Absolutely.
And I just wondered if this is something yourself or your team could help with, because I can quite easily set up a MS Teams meeting for all
absolutely.
of us.
Some of our colleagues that are here would be aware of the regional delivery groups, which we've set up to pretty much have this conversation and gather lots of these types of insights into some of what we can do to start to move the dial. What we started to do is produce these types of guidance documents that is talked about, and some of them are available on the Futures Hub as well. And some of what's been mentioned today I've noted down as well in terms of creating an overarching set of principles of what's in and what's out. But I think, like Craig and David mentioned, it's just there's a local nuance to a lot of this as well in terms of what you can do locally, and what we don't want to do is take the attention away from people focusing on what do you actually understand in your local context. So that would be but in terms of just creating general guidance and general principles, so we've got the technical annex where we've kind of outlined all the actions that we think would be necessary on a yearly basis to kind of help us transition to net zero, and a lot of the documents and guidance that we're bringing out are on the back of that, so that we can manage this in quite a succinct way. But by definitely, I agree that some of those guidance are useful, and we've already started producing some of them as well. We've got guidance, especially around heat decarbonisation plans, and a lot of tools that you can use to kind of help you estimate your demand and potentially start to understand what you put in together for like a consultant brief and stuff like that. So a lot of this we will take through the regional delivery groups as well.
Okay, fabulous. I am really conscious of the time. I know we've gone past the 1 o'clock. David Knowles, you asked a question. Craig and David Oliver, are you able to quickly pick that up? Because I realised that I pushed it.
So the question that David asked really was whether we go back to the old days of electric heating, you know, whether we use electric heating and electric panel heating. And of course, at the moment, that's far too expensive. The other problem with things like night storage, for example, is whilst it does shift demand to the night time, and that might be what the future looks like, at the moment, it's expensive, and also it's a capacity issue. It means to actually heat all those radiators at night could be beyond the capacity of the local substation, whilst with heat pumps you maybe only use half as much electricity as you produce heat. But the heat is harder to store in heat pumps, so it's, you know, it is a potential part of the solution. And in fact, one of the things that's been looked at is something called near field infrared to try and keep people warmer at certain times of day. And you know, what I think is that the final solutions for these hospitals will actually be combinations of the you know, of the various different items. I mean, it might be, for example, that electric heating is used to boost heat pump water up to 60 degrees for Legionella control.
Thank you. Craig, do you want to add anything to that? And
I think just adding in terms of that, in terms of ventilation and things like that, I think once you start building up that roadmap to decarbonisation, I think that will highlight the sort of technologies that you'll need in each ward and department. Because I think, sort of burn on David's point, it will depend on an office block that's under NHS operation is going to be very difficult to very different to a theatre or an ICU to an A&E, and that's kind of where we need to get to in terms of that phasing and that understanding of there might be different technologies that need to interact with each other at certain areas of the estate.
Okay, fabulous, thanks. And David just made a comment saying thank you to both David Oliver and you, Craig. Thank you all. I'm going to draw it to a close now. Just, Craig, I don't know what you said then because I didn't hear it. I'm hoping it's delayed on my screen. I'm going to draw it to a close as we've gone past 1 o'clock. Just want to remind everybody that all the recording of all the Lunch and Learn sessions are available on the West Yorkshire ICB website. So if you just Google West Yorkshire ICB, it'll take you to the website and you can see the recordings there. So thank you again for joining, and thank you. Fantastic presentation from Craig and David, and really look forward to seeing you all again soon. Mary, if you're still online, and anybody actually, I've got my email address, so if nothing else, if you're really stuck, come back to me. I've put it on the chat. Come back to me and I will redirect you to the relevant person. So yeah, thank you again to Craig and David Oliver. Look forward to seeing you again soon sometime, and have a lovely Christmas, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and you.
Hello, my name's Luke Champion from Avon and Wiltshire Mental Health Partnership NHS Trust. I'm the Energy and Sustainability Manager for the Trust. Sorry I can't be with you today. I forgot that I was actually going on leave, so yeah, it's good to get the holidays in. We definitely need it. So yeah, I'll just give you a sort of short presentation into the HDPs that we commissioned at our trust, and the sort of learning curve and learning experiences that we've experienced with that process, and relating that to the Salex PSDS 3B process as well. So yeah, just might give you some pointers on that. Okay, so if you see me glance down or look around a bit, I'm probably trying to see my notes, so I'll try and do the best I can. It might be a bit jittery, so hopefully this will work. Ignore the transcript if you get that, because it's probably got a few ums in it and it might not pick up my West Country twang. Anyway, so yeah, so what did we do? So with the heat decarbonisation plans, we basically were able to get some of them were done with LCSF Salex funding. We put a bid in and managed to get some funding for some of them. Others we did with our own funding. So I won't go into all the rigmaroles of what one was what, but essentially looking at the list, we've basically got basically 3/4 of them were done with LCSF funding, and one of them was done with our own funding from the trust. So I'll just go through the list quickly. We had 4 sites, as it were. One of them was Elm Way, which is based in Weston-super-Mare, just outside of Bristol. It's a fairly medium-sized building, like a rehab unit, rehab house basically, and there's 7 beds there, so not massive. The next one in Weston-super-Mare was Longfox non-PFI part. It's basically got 2 buildings there, one PFI and one non-PFI, both opposite each other. The non-PFI building has got 2 wards, but one's currently not active. It's used as a sort of storeroom, temporary building, so that's just 1 ward, Juniper Ward. And we had a HDB carried out at that one, and that was carried out by LCSF funding. Yes, that's that. We also had another one at Salisbury, which is our Fountain Way site. That consists of 4 buildings, so a much larger inpatient unit. 2 of the buildings at that site are inpatient units and with wards, and 2 are a mix of admin services and outpatient rooms. So basically people can go to have consultations and things. And they were carried out with LCSF funding from Salex. So what did we find when we had these HDPs carried out? So essentially overall in general, we found that the quality was variable. Some HDPs from one consultant that we chose, we had 2 consultancies doing them. We had Elm Way, that was done by Clancy Consultants who work for our PFI. And we had the other 3, so I've missed one out actually. Woodside building was on that list. That's part of our Cullington Road inpatient site. So just 1 building there. So Clancy Consultants did Elm Way. Hawley Consultants, who some of you may know, they're quite a big consultancy. They covered our Woodside building at Callington Road in Bristol, Long Fox unit in Weston-super-Mare, and our Fountain Way site in Salisbury. So we found that, in summary, the HDPs carried out by Hawley were very detailed. They had, you know, good explanation of sort of the general layout of the buildings. So it did have good detail. The problem was they were too generic when it came to specifying heat pumps and the sort of technical data of what sort of systems would work in the sites themselves, and ended up going off on too much detail on things we weren't really interested in. So yeah, we found that was a problem. A professional looking report, but when you really needed it, it didn't have all the technical information that we required, and that was a massive problem when it came to you trying to use those HDPs to put in a funding bid for Salex under PSDS 3B, the most recent capital funding round that happened with Salex. That was a problem. In the end, we were trying to use their Woodside building HDP for a Salex bid, and in the end we decided to completely junk it because we just did not have enough specific information, and we didn't have enough time to get that. So that kind of dropped us in it really, which is a bit annoying. We did put in a bid for Hawley's HDP that they carried out for us at Fountain Way, although again, because it was lacking in technical detail, it meant I had to do a lot of work myself trying to get hold of that technical detail, and in the end it became quite a lot, and it took over a lot of my working time, meaning once we got round to submitting a bid on the day that the bid portal opened, instead of it being close to 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it was more like 4:30 in the afternoon. So there was a big delay there, because it was just by that point the portal was crashing, and yeah, it just became very, very difficult. So I'm not confident we'll get very far with that particular bid, which again is a shame, primarily because it was lacking in technical detail. Okay, so there's your problem with the ones we had carried out by Hawley. It wasn't specific enough. So on to Clancy. So Clancy Consultants, they were the ones chosen to do Elm Way, the rehab building in Weston-super-Mare. So what we found with Clancy is overall the detail, there wasn't a huge amount of detail in general with the report, the HDP, but what we did find is that they were better at the technical detail. So they were a lot more specific. They were very specific, in fact, in saying, okay, well, this is your building. We've decided that the best way to move to a low carbon heating system is to do X, Y, and Z. And by the way, this is the sort of radiant. This is the heating panels we'd be using to replace the ceiling panels. We'd use low surface temperature radiators. Here's the specification. Here's the exact model. And also here is the heat pump model with the data sheet and all that sort of stuff. So that was really, really useful, because that stuff is essential when you're doing a PSDS 3B bid. Salex expects you to have your technical information ready. You can't just say, I'm going to have this heat pump and then not provide any technical backup for it. You have to have that. So that was really useful from Clancy. So although they were lacking in some areas, they were really good at that. And also we found they were very good at responding to our technical questions that we needed to answer when we had our technical review carried out by Salex. And in fact, we're still kind of in progress with that at the moment. We've had a few rounds with them where they've asked us for clarity on a few things about heat pump design, and we've sent them back in time. And basically we are waiting on their technical review sort of summary that will explain to us whether they're going to give us a grant offer letter or not. So over the next few weeks or days, I expect to know the outcome of that one. So yeah, that'll be good if we get it. I'm fairly confident we will, because we have dealt with the technical reviews quite you know, quite well, and I'm quite confident of our knowledge. Myself and the consultant have got a good working relationship there from Clancy, so I think we'll get somewhere, but you never quite know with Salix, so I'm not going to predict anything I tried to be too accurate in my prediction. So I think overall, with the learning we've got from this, is overall there is a big gap between what you would put in a HDP and then what you'd expect to get out of that and what you can use that HDP for when it comes to doing a PSDS bid. The amount of extra information that you will need is a lot. Politely put, it's a lot. So what you'll need to make sure about is either you get a HDP done by your consultant on the proviso that they will be able to supply the required technical information for a bid, or what might be a better plan, in fact what we want to do next time, is what we're going to do is we will commission the consultant to do a REBA 4, at least a REBA 4 level design, so it would have that level of detail in it anyway. And there may obviously be like some technical things that we'll need to add to the bid process, but we're pretty confident if you've got a good working relationship with your consultant, that shouldn't be a massive problem. So yeah, so it's really recognise that there will be a big gap between the HDP content and what you'll need to write your bid. And then it's a case really, I guess, of making sure your chosen consultant is on the same page. We thought we were with both of them, but I think going forward what we're going to have to do is, if we use, I'm sure we'll use Clancy again, we probably will use Hawley again, I'm hoping, but we need to spell it out very clear of exactly what we're looking for. I think that's the way you've got to do it. Be very specific, have a meeting and say, look, we want this, this, this and this in the bid. You need to make, sorry, in the HDP. So you're almost making an enhanced HDP, which will get you ready for a bid. I think that's the way to do it, because otherwise you could be left in the lurch, kind of like we were, and having to scramble around at the last minute, like not putting information together, but literally learning and creating the information required. So I wouldn't go down that road if I were you. So my recommendation would be, yeah, get a good consultant, sit down with them, tell them exactly what you need, but also make sure that, well, I'd advise using that consultant and going to a REBA 4 level design, and then you've kind of hopefully done most of the work already. Anyway, so that's enough from me. Obviously I can't answer questions live, but if you need to speak to me at all or get any more information, I'm happy to sort of help you through a learning process, or, you know, give you some experience of where we've been with it. My email address is lukechampion@nhs.net, no dots between my name, so just plain lukechampion@nhs.net. Okay, thank you very much. I will try and stop recording now, so I've got to find my button.